There's something most people don't know about Tsunade, and it begins long before she ever appeared on the page. When Masashi Kishimoto sat down to build the world of Naruto, he didn't invent his legendary trio from nothing. He reached back into old Japanese folklore to a classic tale called Jiraiya Goketsu Monogatari, the story of the gallant Jiraiya. In that tale, 3 ninja are each bound to a creature. One is linked to a toad, one to a snake, and one to a slug. Kishimoto took that ancient triangle and rebuilt it as the legendary Sannin. Jiraiya became the toad, Orochimaru became the snake, and Tsunade, the granddaughter of a Hokage, one of the strongest ninja alive, became the slug. Now that might sound like a strange fate for a hero, but it was a deliberate choice, and it tells you a lot about how Kishimoto thinks. Because you'd expect the granddaughter of the First Hokage to be a proud symbol of the village. You'd expect her to stand at the gates of Konoha, loyal, dignified, carrying the weight of the Senju name. But that's not who we meet. When Tsunade first walks into the story, she has abandoned the village entirely. She's a bitter gambler, drifting from town to town, drowning old grief in sake and losing money at nearly every table she sits at. Her nickname, the legendary sucker, comes not from her strength, but from how reliably she loses her bets. So why would Kishimoto take the descendant of a founder and turn her into a wanderer with a gambling habit? Because the contradiction is the point. Tsunade carries enormous power and an even heavier past, and instead of making her a flawless icon, Kishimoto gave her wounds. She lost the people she loved, and she ran. That single decision makes her feel human in a way a perfect hero never could, and it sets up the entire arc of someone slowly finding their way back home. That folklore root shows up in her jutsu, too. Her signature summon is a slug named Katsuyu, and on the surface, that's an odd choice. Toads are powerful, snakes are dangerous and cunning. But slugs? Slugs are seen as weak, slow, unremarkable, the kind of creature nobody fears. You'd think the strongest kunoichi in the world deserved something more intimidating. But here's the twist. Katsuyu can split her body into countless smaller versions of herself, scattering across an entire battlefield. And each one can heal. Where a toad crushes and a snake strikes, the slug mends. During the Great War, that single ability lets Tsunade tend to thousands of wounded soldiers at once, something no toad or snake could ever do. The creature everyone overlooked turns out to be one of the most valuable summons in the entire series. And that quiet reversal, weakness hiding strength, runs all the way down to her name. But what's really surprising comes next, because even the sound of her name is often read as working against expectation. Tsunade is one of the most destructive fighters ever drawn in the series. Her chakra-enhanced strength can shatter the ground and split boulders with a single finger. But many fans have noted that her name doesn't point toward that raw power at all. Some connect it instead to ideas of gentleness and care, a softness they see woven right into her identity. Read that way, the woman who can crack the earth is defined, at her core, not by destruction, but by healing. It's a quiet contradiction some see baked into her design, and once you notice it, you start to see it everywhere in how she's written. The fierce exterior, the tender purpose underneath. There's a more practical secret hidden in Tsunade too, one that lives in the artwork itself. Kishimoto has openly admitted that she is one of the trickiest characters for him to draw. Her proportions are difficult to keep consistent, and getting her right takes real effort panel to panel. And if you look closely, some readers feel Tsunade tends to appear in wider, more deliberate, more posed compositions. She's often framed standing tall, or captured in a strong, settled stance, rather than crammed into the fast, chaotic motion panels that other characters live in. Whether or not that was intentional, It fits the idea of a working artist quietly solving a problem, giving her the kind of framing that let him keep her looking like herself. So even the way she's staged on the page may trace back to a very human challenge behind the scenes. Put all of that together, and a pattern starts to emerge. Tsunade was never designed to be simple. She began as the slug of an old folk tale, the one creature nobody expects to matter. She was given the bloodline of a founder, and then handed the flaws of a woman who couldn't bear her losses. She was made overwhelmingly powerful, and then tied to a name and a summon that many read as whispering of healing rather than harm. And she was built by an artist who found her genuinely hard to draw. Every one of those pieces pulls against the obvious version of her, the flawless royal heir she could so easily have been. And that's what makes her origins worth pausing on. Long before the battles, before the redemption, before she ever agreed to return to Konoha, Tsunade was already a study in contradiction. A hero shaped, quietly and deliberately, out of everything you wouldn't expect a hero to be. What very few people realize is that Tsunade's story doesn't begin with strength at all. It begins with expectation, and with a name that carried more weight than any child should have to hold. Because before she was one of the legendary Sannin, before the world knew her as the greatest medical ninja who ever lived, Tsunade was simply the granddaughter of Hashirama Senju, the First Hokage, and the grandniece of Tobirama, the second. That lineage made her something close to royalty within the walls of Konoha. She was born into the founding bloodline of the entire village, descended directly from the man who shaped it into existence. And so, from the very moment she could walk, people didn't just see a little girl. They saw the future of the Senju clan, the living continuation of a legacy that had already changed the world. But here's the quiet contradiction at the heart of it all. You might assume that a child born into that kind of pedigree would be groomed carefully, kept close, protected like a treasure. Instead, she was placed on a standard genin team and trained by Hiruzen Sarutobi, the man who would go on to become the third Hokage. Think about what that arrangement actually means. Tsunade, granddaughter of the first, was being taught by the student of the first and second. It's a detail that's easy to overlook, but it quietly places her at the exact center of Konoha's leadership timeline. She was the second generation of the village's greatest ninja, learning from the bridge between the founders and everyone who came after. The teacher-student thread that runs through the entire series, Hashirama to Hiruzen, Hiruzen to Tsunade, and eventually onward, passes directly through her hands. Now, on that same genin team stood two other children whose names you already know. One was a boy with wild white hair and an even wilder imagination, Jiraiya. The other was a pale, quiet, unsettlingly gifted boy named Orochimaru. 3 students, 1 teacher, and none of them yet aware of what they would become. But that trio would eventually earn a title so famous it echoes through the entire history of the ninja world, the legendary Sannin. And this is where most people make an assumption that turns out to be completely wrong. Because when you hear a title like Legendary Sannin, you naturally picture it as an honor they earned, a rank they were awarded, maybe something they proudly chose for themselves. It sounds like a badge of prestige handed down by their own village. But the truth is far stranger and far more interesting. The name wasn't given to them by an ally at all. It was given to them by an enemy. During the Second Shinobi World War, the 3 of them faced Hanzo of the Salamander, a warrior so powerful that entire nations feared him, a man who single-handedly defined an era of combat. Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Orochimaru fought him together, and by every reasonable measure, they should not have survived. They didn't defeat him. They simply endured him. And Hanzo, standing over 3 young ninja who had managed to live through an encounter that would have killed almost anyone else, was so impressed by their sheer refusal to fall that he named them on the spot. He called them the Sannin, the 3 legendary ninja. Their most famous title, the words that would follow them for the rest of their lives, came from the mouth of the man who nearly killed them. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because for all the grandeur of that legacy, the founding bloodline, the elite training, the enemy-given legend, there was one trait about Tsunade that had nothing to do with power at all. Long before she ever became a Hokage, Tsunade grew into someone obsessed with gambling. She bet on nearly everything. It became far more than a passing habit. It settled deep into who she was, into the very grain of her nature. She would wager on games, on outcomes, on the smallest uncertainties, chasing that thrill of the unknown. And what makes this detail so quietly remarkable is how completely it would come to define her adult life. The woman descended from Hokage, the medical genius, the strongest kunoichi of her generation. She was also, famously, one of the unluckiest gamblers who ever lived. In fact, her losses became so legendary that people came to understand the opposite is true. Whenever Tsunade actually won a bet, it was treated as a terrible omen, a sign that something catastrophic was about to happen. Her good luck was so rare that it frightened the people around her. So consider the strange arithmetic of who she was. A child of royal ninja blood, raised at the center of the village's leadership line, trained by a future Hokage, named a legend by her deadliest enemy, and yet, at her core, a compulsive gambler who almost always lost. She was built from contradictions that shouldn't fit together, a hero assembled out of the exact traits you'd never expect a hero to possess. And that tension between the greatness she was born into and the flaws she carried freely would shape every choice she made in the decades to come. Because the legend of Tsunade was never really about the bloodline she inherited. It was about everything she did in spite of it. The story of Tsunade often gets told through her strength, through the way she could shatter stone with a single finger or heal wounds that other medics called hopeless. But if you look closely at the objects she carried, rather than the power she wielded, one detail stands out more than any battle she ever fought. Around her neck, for most of her life, she wore a single green crystal on a simple cord. It looks like decoration. It is anything but. That necklace once belonged to Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, and Tsunade's grandfather. In a village obsessed with bloodlines and inherited jutsu, this was something rarer than any technique. It was a physical piece of the man who founded the Hidden Leaf, passed down through the most powerful family in the entire ninja world. So when people called Tsunade the granddaughter of the first, they usually mean it as a title. But she wore the proof of it every single day, resting against her collarbone. In terms of value, there is almost nothing in the series that compares. You cannot copy it, you cannot earn it, and there was only ever one. Which brings us to the strange record this necklace quietly holds. Because Tsunade did not keep it for herself. She gave it away, twice, to the 2 people she loved most. First to her younger brother Nawaki, on his birthday, as a gift meant to protect the boy who dreamed of becoming Hokage. He died the very next day. Years later, she gave it again, this time to Dan, the man she loved and hoped to build a future with. And Dan died shortly after as well, bleeding out despite everything her medical skill could do. So think about the odds she was staring at. 2 people, 2 gifts, 2 deaths, both arriving almost immediately. To Tsunade, this stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a pattern. She came to believe the necklace was cursed, that anyone she handed it to was marked for death. And this is where a piece of jewelry becomes the key to understanding her entire character. Her fear of loss, her decision to leave the village, her gambling, her drinking, all of it traces back in part to this single object and the 2 funerals attached to it. The fans even gave it a name for exactly this reason. They call it the Necklace of Death. Now here is where the logic turns. If you truly believed an object killed the last 2 people you gave it to, you would lock it away forever. But that is not what Tsunade did. When she finally met Naruto, a loud, stubborn boy who declared, without a shred of doubt, that he would become Hokage, she recognized the same dream that had died with Nawaki and Dan. And so she made him a bet. If he could master the Rasengan in 1 week, she would hand him the necklace. If he failed, she would take everything he owned. It sounds like a simple wager. It was not. She was betting the most valuable heirloom in her possession, the supposed cursed object, on whether this child would live long enough to prove her fear wrong. And yet, the most unexpected part is still to come. Because the necklace, it turns out, was never just a family keepsake or a symbol of grief. It carried a hidden function that almost no one talks about. This crystal has the ability to suppress and control chakra, and specifically, it can influence the chakra of the 9-tailed fox. When Naruto's rage began pushing him toward the 9-tails' power during that same training arc, the necklace physically reacted, and it played a role in reining that transformation back in. So the object Tsunade wore for decades, purely as a memory of the people she lost, was quietly one of the few things in the world capable of restraining the most destructive force sealed inside a human being. Sit with how strange that is. The Senju, generations earlier, crafted or acquired an item that could dampen tailed beast chakra. That is not the kind of thing you make by accident. It hints that Hashirama and his family understood the tailed beasts on a level far deeper than their reputation as warriors suggests. Hashirama, after all, was the one who captured multiple tailed beasts and distributed them among the hidden villages in the first place. A necklace that can hold that power in check fits perfectly into that history. It just spent most of the story hidden in plain sight, mistaken for jewelry. So the record Tsunade holds is a quiet one. She is the only character who owned an object this valuable, this personal, and this dangerous all at once, and who then chose to give it to a boy she had known for barely a week. Naruto won the bet. He learned the Rasengan, and for the first time, the necklace passed to someone who did not die. The curse, if there ever was one, was broken by the exact kind of reckless faith Tsunade had spent years refusing to feel. That is the thread worth remembering here. Not the strength, not the healing, but a single green stone that connected a first Hokage to a future one, that outlived 2 people she loved, and that carried a secret power nobody expected. In a story full of grand techniques, sometimes the most telling detail is the smallest one, hanging quietly around someone's neck. Behind the familiar appearance of Tsunade, there's a detail that quietly contradicts almost everything a first-time viewer assumes about her. When you meet her, she looks young. She looks, at most, like a woman in her 20s, sharp, confident, physically imposing. And because this is a world of ninja, where lifespans and abilities bend in strange directions, most people simply accept that appearance at face value. They assume she's young because the story never stops to correct them. But that assumption is wrong. And the truth underneath it is one of the more interesting, quiet reveals in the entire series. Tsunade is not in her 20s. During the main events of the story, she is over 50 years old. She's a member of the founding generation's grandchildren, a granddaughter of the First Hokage, and she lived through the same wars and losses that aged everyone else around her. So the natural question becomes obvious. If she's over 50, why does she look decades younger than she should? The easy answer would be that ninja simply age slowly, that chakra keeps the body preserved. It's a tidy explanation, and it's the one most people quietly settle on. But that's not what's happening at all. The youthful face you see is not her real face. It's a genjutsu, an illusion she casts on herself, constantly, without pause. She holds this transformation technique in place every waking moment, layering a younger version of herself over the truth. Her actual appearance is that of an elderly woman, lined and weathered by every year she's actually lived. So the thing that looks like natural preservation is really an act of deliberate, unbroken effort. She is, in a sense, performing youth every second she's on screen, and almost no one around her seems to notice or question it. That leads to the more human part of it, because the reason she does this isn't tactical. It isn't for infiltration or disguise in the way most transformation techniques are used. She developed this particular illusion out of vanity, and out of something quieter and heavier than vanity: avoidance. Tsunade lost people. She lost her younger brother, Nawaki, who died young carrying a dream of becoming Hokage. And she lost the man she loved, Dan, who died in her arms despite everything her medical skill could do. Those two losses broke something in her, and they left behind a fear of time itself. To look at her own aged face in a mirror would be to measure exactly how many years had passed since the people she loved were taken from her. So she chose instead to hide from that reflection. The illusion isn't just cosmetic. It's a way of refusing to confront how much time has slipped by. But here's what almost nobody knows on a first watch. The illusion has a cost, and that cost is what makes it so revealing. A genjutsu maintained around the clock is not free. It draws on her chakra continuously, quietly, in the background of everything she does. And so the technique carries a built-in weakness. The moment her chakra runs low, the illusion can't hold. The younger face flickers and falls away, and her true elderly appearance is exposed for anyone watching. This is the part that flips the whole thing around. You'd expect the mask to slip in calm, ordinary moments. Instead, it slips at the worst possible times. Because when does a ninja burn through their chakra fastest? In their hardest, most desperate battles. The fights where they're pushing every reserve they have to the absolute edge. So Tsunade's real face doesn't appear when she's resting. It appears in the middle of her most punishing combat, when she spent almost everything she has to protect the people around her. The exact moment she's at her most powerful and most self-sacrificing is the same moment the disguise fails and shows the truth of who she really is. That's the counterintuitive core of it. The illusion is strongest when she's safe, and it breaks precisely when she's giving everything. And this wasn't an accident of the storytelling. Kishimoto built the transformation to work exactly this way, using it as a deliberate narrative tool. He arranged it so that her true face, the aged, tired, deeply human face beneath the illusion, surfaces at the specific moments when she's most emotionally exposed, when she's terrified, when she's grieving, when she's throwing herself in front of an attack she might not survive. The mask comes off not through weakness of character, but through the sheer weight of what she's willing to spend for others. So the visual and the emotion line up perfectly. The face you see in those moments is the real one, revealed by the very act of caring too much to hold anything back. It reframes the whole character once you understand it. The confident young Sannin striding into a battlefield is, quite literally, a performance held together by will and chakra. Underneath is a woman who has lived a long time, lost more than most, and decided she'd rather hide from her own reflection than face the years it counts. The youth is the lie. The exhaustion is the truth. And every time the illusion cracks in the heat of a fight, you're not watching her fall apart. You're watching the mask finally step aside to show exactly who was standing there all along. If you look closely at Tsunade, you'll notice that almost everything remarkable about her began as an accident, a twist of circumstance that pointed her toward a destiny she never actually set out to claim. She is remembered as the greatest medical ninja the world has ever produced, the woman who rewrote the rules of survival on the battlefield. But she didn't arrive there through ambition. She arrived there through loss, and through a series of moments that could have easily broken her instead of shaping her. Start with what she's known for. Before Tsunade, a wound on the battlefield was often a death sentence. There were healers, of course, but no organized system, no standard for what a medical unit should be, no protocol for keeping soldiers alive long enough to fight another day. Tsunade changed all of that. She established the principle that every squad sent into war should include at least one medical ninja trained to her standards, and she developed the diagnostic and healing techniques that became the foundation of the entire system. She essentially invented modern battlefield medicine for the ninja world. So when people call her a legend, it isn't flattery. Countless lives were saved by rules she wrote in wars she wasn't even present for. And here's the first contradiction, the first strange twist. The greatest medical ninja alive, the woman who could stop bleeding with a touch, who understood the human body better than anyone, is terrified of blood. Not uncomfortable around it, terrified. She suffers from hemophobia, a genuine, paralyzing fear of the sight of blood. It's the kind of detail that seems impossible when you first hear it. How does someone who spends her life inside open wounds freeze at the very thing her profession is made of? But that contradiction isn't a flaw in the writing. It's the whole point of who she is. Because the fear didn't come from nowhere. It came from the two most important people she ever lost. Her younger brother, Nawaki, was killed on the battlefield as a boy, dying from his injuries before anyone could reach him. And later, the man she loved, Dan Kato, bled out in her arms while she tried desperately to save him. She had the skill. She had the hands that could heal almost anything. But she couldn't stop it in time, and she watched the life drain out of the two people she cared about most through the same red she had trained her whole life to master. So the blood stopped being a substance to her. It became the memory of failure. It became the sight of everything she couldn't hold on to. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting, because that fear is exactly what drove her away, and that departure is what set up the accident that changed everything. Unable to face the profession she had perfected, unable to stand in a hospital or on a battlefield without seeing Dan and Nawaki all over again, Tsunade simply left. She walked out of Konoha. She wandered. She gambled, she drank, she ran up debts, and she carried her grief across the countryside for years, refusing to be the healer everyone remembered. The strongest medical ninja in the world had essentially retired from healing entirely, hiding from her own gift. Now here's where the twist turns. Dan, before he died, had a dream. He wanted to become Hokage, not for power, but to protect the people he loved, to build something that would outlast him. Nawaki had carried that same dream as a child, the same fierce belief that he could shield the village with his own hands. Both of them died holding that dream, and when they died, Tsunade stopped believing in it. She decided that dreams like that were foolish, that they only got people killed, and she spent years telling herself that anyone who chased the title of Hokage was a fool waiting to bleed out just like they did. So consider what happens when she meets Naruto, a loud, stubborn, penniless boy with no talent for subtlety and no interest in giving up. He tells her, without hesitation, that he's going to become Hokage. It's the exact dream she had buried. It's the same words, the same reckless certainty, spoken by someone who hasn't yet learned that the world can take those dreams away. And instead of pushing her further into her grief, it does the opposite. Because Naruto doesn't just talk. He bleeds, he fights, he keeps standing up when he has no reason to, and he refuses to let her write off the dream she thought had died with Dan.
That encounter is the lucky twist that changes everything. It wasn't planned. Jiraiya only brought Naruto along to track her down, and the search was really about convincing Tsunade to return as the Fifth Hokage. But it's the boy, not the mission, that reaches her. Watching him risk his life for a belief she had abandoned forces her, for the first time in years, to face the blood without running from it. In the middle of a fight, when it matters most, she steps in front of him and shields him, hemophobia and all. The fear doesn't vanish. She simply chooses something bigger than it. And that's the accident that made her Hokage. Not strategy, not ambition. A chance meeting with a boy who happened to carry the exact dream she needed to remember. The healer who ran from blood came back because someone reminded her why she ever learned to stop it. People rarely talk about Tsunade as an engineer, but that's exactly what she is. Everyone remembers the punch, the fist that splits the earth, the finger flick that sends a grown ninja flying across a battlefield. It looks like brute force, the kind of raw power you'd expect from someone born into the Senju bloodline. But that's the misunderstanding, and it's worth slowing down to correct it. Because Tsunade's strength was never really about muscle at all. The secret is chakra control. She learned to gather her chakra and release it at the exact instant of impact, focusing an enormous amount of energy into a single point of contact. That's why she can shatter solid ground with one strike, or demolish an opponent with nothing more than a flick of one finger. The power isn't in her arm, it's in her timing. The precise, split-second release of energy that most ninja could never hope to control. She turned a medic's steadiest skill, the delicate control needed to heal, into something devastating. And that connection matters, because it links her to the very foundation of what medical ninjutsu is supposed to be. Healing requires the finest chakra control of any discipline in the ninja world. You can't repair a body by flooding it with power. You have to be gentle, exact, almost surgical. So the same training that made Tsunade the greatest medical ninja alive is the reason she can also destroy. The healing hand and the shattering fist come from the same root. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole point of how Kishimoto built her. Now, you'd assume that kind of power would demand enormous reserves of chakra. Overwhelming strength usually comes at overwhelming cost. But here's where Tsunade quietly breaks the pattern. Her real genius isn't the size of her chakra, it's her efficiency. She wastes almost nothing. Every ounce of energy is placed exactly where it needs to be, at exactly the right moment, and nothing spills out uselessly around it. In a world full of ninja who burn through their chakra in flashy, wasteful bursts, she's the one who treats it like something precious. And that discipline is what sets up her most extraordinary ability. It's called the Strength of 100 seal. You've probably seen the mark, that violet diamond-shaped seal on her forehead. It looks decorative, almost like jewelry, but it isn't. That seal is the visible tip of something she spent years quietly building. Over long stretches of time, Tsunade stores chakra into that single point on her forehead, drop by drop, the way you might slowly fill a reservoir behind a dam. She isn't using it. She's saving it. And because she's so efficient, she can afford to set aside a reserve most ninja could never accumulate in the first place. Then, When she needs it, she releases it. The seal opens, and all that stored energy floods through her body at once. The lines spread across her skin like veins of ink, and what they carry is regeneration on a scale almost nobody else in the series can match. This is where her medical mastery becomes something genuinely frightening. But what's really surprising comes next. We tend to think of healing as gentle, defensive, the thing you do after the fighting is over. Tsunade turned that idea inside out. With the strength of 100 seal active, she can instantly close wounds that would kill any other ninja on the spot. Injuries that should end a battle simply don't end hers. She takes the hit, and the damage undoes itself in real time. In effect, this makes her nearly unkillable in combat. Not because she avoids being wounded, but because being wounded no longer stops her. Think about what that does to a fight. Most strategy in the ninja world depends on landing the decisive blow, the one strike your enemy can't recover from. Against Tsunade, that logic falls apart. You can hit her, and she keeps coming. So her opponents are forced to fight a person who has quietly removed the one thing every battle usually relies on: consequences. And she did it not with some forbidden power or borrowed technique, but by pushing her own medical knowledge to its absolute limit. That's the connection that ties her whole character together. Kishimoto didn't design the strength of 100 seal as a separate combat trick bolted onto a healer. He built it as the natural extension of what she already was. She spent her life studying how bodies break and how they mend. So her ultimate technique is simply that same understanding applied to herself at maximum intensity. The greatest medical ninja became the hardest ninja to kill, because those are, in the end, the same skill. And it comes full circle to where her story began. The woman who once ran from blood, who couldn't bear the sight of it, eventually turned the study of wounds into her greatest strength. The very thing that broke her became the source of a power almost no one could overcome. She didn't leave healing behind to become a fighter. She carried it forward until healing itself was the most dangerous thing about her. That's the quiet truth beneath all the shattered ground and the cracked earth. Every bit of it traces back to the steady, careful hands of a doctor. Curiously enough, Tsunade never set out to become a leader at all. She was a healer, a scientist of the human body, someone who understood better than anyone how fragile life truly is. And yet, when the story of the hidden leaf reached one of its lowest points, it was her name that rose to the top of the list. She became the Fifth Hokage, and with that title, she made history in a way the village had never seen before. In all the generations that came before her, in every succession of leaders stretching back to her own grandfather, no woman had ever held the position. Tsunade was the first woman to sit at the head of Konoha, the first to carry that weight on her shoulders. But here's the part that makes it interesting. She didn't want it, not even a little. When Jiraiya put her name forward as a candidate, he wasn't offering her a gift she'd been longing for. He was asking someone who had spent years running from the very idea of the village. Tsunade had left Konoha behind. She carried grief with her everywhere she went. The loss of her younger brother, the loss of the man she loved, both of them gone chasing the same dream of becoming Hokage. So to her, that title wasn't an honor. It was a curse. It was the thing that had taken everyone she cared about. Therefore, when Jiraiya found her and told her the village needed her, her first answer was no. A firm, bitter, absolute no. What changed her mind wasn't a speech about duty. It wasn't pressure or politics. It was a boy. Naruto Uzumaki stood in front of her, loud and stubborn and completely unwilling to let go of the same dream that had killed the people she mourned. And instead of that dream dying in his hands the way it had died before, he held on to it with everything he had. He believed in the village so completely that even Tsunade, who had spent years convinced that dream was a poison, started to see it differently. So she said yes. She placed her grandfather's necklace around his neck, the very heirloom she had once sworn no one else would ever wear, and she walked back to the place she had spent so long avoiding. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the woman who returned wasn't just filling a seat, she truly became the protector of that village. Years later, when Pain launched his assault on the Hidden Leaf and tore through it with a power almost no one could counter, Tsunade didn't hide behind her office. She stood at the center of the destruction and stretched her strength to its absolute limit. She had a technique she'd spent her life perfecting, a reserve of chakra stored over years, meant to heal and shield in a single moment of crisis. And she spent it all at once, extending a protective barrier over the villagers so that when the final blow came, the people beneath her survived. The effort emptied her completely. It drained her so severely that she collapsed into a coma, her body pushed far past what it could recover from quickly. She gave everything she had to keep the village standing. But strength, in the end, isn't what she's remembered for most. And this is the part that's easy to overlook. Tsunade's real legacy isn't the ground she could shatter with a single finger, or the medical jutsu that could bring people back from the edge of death. Her real legacy walked around on 2 feet and carried her lessons forward. Her students. Above all, Sakura Haruno. A girl who started with no special bloodline, no rare talent, nothing that marked her as extraordinary, and who, under Tsunade's teaching, became one of the finest medical ninja the world had ever seen. Sakura inherited the precise chakra control, the healing techniques, and even that same terrifying, monstrous strength. Everything Tsunade knew, she passed down. Therefore, when Tsunade eventually stepped back, the knowledge didn't disappear with her. It lived on, refined and carried forward by the people she trained. And that's the quiet symmetry at the heart of her whole story. Think about where she began. A young woman so broken by loss that she fled Konoha and refused to look back. Someone who couldn't even stand the sight of blood for years because of the trauma she carried. That person, by any reasonable expectation, should never have become a symbol of hope. But she did. The girl who ran away in grief became the leader who protected the village with her own body. The one who hated the dream of the Hokage became the Hokage who inspired the next generation to chase it. In many ways, she embodied her grandfather's will of fire, that belief that every leader lives on through the people they protect and the students they teach, more completely than almost anyone before or after her. Not because she was born to it, not because she wanted it, but because, in the end, she chose it. She took the weight she'd spent her whole life running from, and she carried it with steady, careful hands. The same hands that had always known how to heal, quietly learning, at last, how to lead. Originally, Tsunade was never meant to be a story about greatness. She was meant to be a story about survival. When people talk about the legendary Sannin, they picture 3 warriors so powerful that a single enemy commander gave them their title out of respect. And that's the version most fans remember. But the truth is quieter than the legend, and, in a way, far more human. Tsunade didn't earn her place among the 3 because she won more battles than anyone else. She earned it because when the Second Great Ninja War ground on and swallowed so many of her comrades, she was still standing at the end of it. The rank wasn't a trophy for victory. It was a mark left by loss. She survived intact when so many others simply did not. and that endurance became the foundation of everything the world would later believe about her. So it's worth pausing on that, because it changes how you read her entire life. The greatest strength she had was never the punch that could crack the earth. It was the refusal to be broken by everything she outlived. And that idea, survival dressed up as legend, sits at the very heart of who Masashi Kishimoto designed her to be. Because when he sat down to create her, he did something deliberately strange. He built her as a grandmother, not in appearance, but in role. In the bloodline of the Senju clan, one of the two founding families of the entire Hidden Leaf, Tsunade stands as a matriarch, an elder, a foundational figure whose lineage reaches all the way back to the beginning. By every rule of the story, she should look the part. A woman of age, of history, of weathered years. But Kishimoto drew her instead as a woman who looks like she's in her 20s. It was a quiet subversion of the usual anime shorthand, where the wise elder always carries wrinkles and gray hair. He took the grandmother of the Senju and gave her the face of youth. And he did it on purpose, because the contradiction was the point. But here's where that contradiction stops being a design choice and becomes something you can actually see happen in the story. That youthful face isn't natural. It isn't good genetics. And it isn't the show simply refusing to age its characters. It's a jutsu. Tsunade is, in truth, well over 50 years old. And the smooth, young appearance she wears every single day is a constant application of the transformation technique, a jutsu she maintains without ever letting it slip. She holds that illusion up like a second skin, hour after hour, year after year. And because it costs chakra to sustain, it comes with a hidden flaw. The moment her chakra runs dry, the disguise collapses, and her real age comes rushing back all at once. It's the kind of detail that turns a simple character quirk into a genuine vulnerability, a mask that can fail at the worst possible moment. So the youth is a performance, held together by will and chakra. And yet, the most unexpected part is still to come. Because behind that carefully maintained face is a lineage that makes her one of the most important people alive. Tsunade is the granddaughter of Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, the man who helped build the village from nothing and whose power became the stuff of myth. That single fact reframes everything about her. She isn't just a skilled ninja who happens to be famous. She is the last direct heir of the Senju, the final living thread carrying that clan's will forward into the modern age. Every expectation her grandfather represented, every hope tied to that name, eventually came to rest on her shoulders alone. And for much of her life, she ran from exactly that weight, which is what makes her final choice to shoulder it feel earned rather than given. But of all the surprising things about Tsunade, the one that lands hardest is the one that seems impossible. She is remembered as the greatest medical ninja the world had ever seen. She revolutionized battlefield healing, trained generations of medics, and set the standard that everyone after her would try to reach. And yet, for years, Tsunade could not stand the sight of blood. Not a mild discomfort, but a real, freezing phobia. A condition that would seize her up in the middle of combat and leave her paralyzed at the exact moment her skills were needed most. It's a cruel irony when you sit with it. The single person best equipped to save lives was, for a long stretch of her life, undone by the very substance that flows through the people she was trying to save. And that phobia wasn't random. It was born from grief, from watching the people she loved bleed and die in front of her, until the color itself became inseparable from loss. So the healer who feared blood, the grandmother who looks like a girl,
the legend crowned for surviving rather than winning. They all point back to the same quiet truth. Tsunade was never defined by the strength she showed the world. She was defined by everything she carried underneath it. The illusion she never let slip. The name she never asked to inherit. And the fear she learned, slowly and painfully, to stand beside instead of run from. One often overlooked detail about Nawaki is how much of Tsunade's adult life quietly grows out of a boy who barely appears on the page. He was her younger brother, a child during the years when the village was still learning what peace even looked like, and his death is one of those small, easily missed origin points that shapes everything she becomes. The moment everyone remembers is his 12th birthday. Tsunade, older and already carrying the weight of the Senju name, gave him a gift that meant more than almost anything she owned. It was their grandfather's necklace, the crystal that had belonged to Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage himself. She placed it around his neck and told him, with the kind of certainty you only give to someone you love, that it would let him become Hokage one day. Nawaki was thrilled. He wanted that dream more than anything. And then he died in battle the very next day. That timing is not an accident, and this is where the hidden design of the story starts to show. Kishimoto uses Nawaki to plant an idea that will haunt Tsunade for the rest of the series, the notion of the cursed necklace. The first Hokage's crystal seems, from that day forward, to bring death to everyone she gives it to. Nawaki received it on his birthday and was gone within a day. So the object stops being a symbol of hope for her and becomes something closer to a warning, a small stone that she comes to believe carries a debt no one can pay. It's a quiet piece of foreshadowing, because the necklace never actually curses anyone, but it teaches you how Tsunade's mind works. She's a gambler by nature, someone who reads the world in terms of odds and losses, and the necklace becomes the ultimate bad bet in her eyes. She gave it away twice, and twice the person she gave it to died young. So she starts treating hope itself as dangerous. But here's what almost nobody notices about how Nawaki functions in the larger story. His dream of becoming Hokage isn't just his own. It's deliberately echoed years later in Naruto Uzumaki, the loud, stubborn boy who wants the exact same thing for the exact same reasons. When Tsunade first meets Naruto, she doesn't just see a genin with an impossible ambition. She sees her little brother. She sees the same fire, the same refusal to listen to reason, the same childish certainty that the Hokage's seat is worth dying for. That's the whole reason the necklace matters so much later on. Tsunade makes a bet with Naruto, one she's certain she'll win, and when she loses, she does something she swore she'd never do again. She hands him the first Hokage's crystal. To the audience, it looks like a simple reward, but if you understand Nawaki, you understand what it actually costs her. She's placing the cursed necklace around the neck of another 12-year-old boy who dreams of being Hokage, knowing exactly what happened the last time she did that. It's an act of faith from a woman who had stopped believing faith was safe. So Nawaki isn't just backstory. He's the template. Kishimoto built Naruto's early relationship with Tsunade as a kind of second chance, a way for her to give the necklace to a Hokage dreaming child and, this time, have him live. When Naruto survives, when he grows, when he eventually does become Hokage, it quietly closes a loop that Nawaki's death opened decades earlier. The Easter egg, if you want to call it that, is that every scene between Tsunade and Naruto is secretly a conversation with a ghost. There's one more detail here, and it's the most surprising.
because it overturned something you might assume about a legendary warrior. You'd expect a woman of Tsunade's power to have been shaped by some great battlefield defeat, some dramatic loss in war. But that's not what changed her. Nawaki's death, more than any battle she ever fought, is what first pushed her toward the idea that would define her legacy as a medic. He died young, in the field, and part of what made it unbearable was the sense that it might have been preventable. So Tsunade began pushing for something the ninja world had never systematically had: a dedicated medical corps assigned to every squad. Trained healers who would travel with the fighting units instead of waiting behind them. The reform she's remembered for, the one that saved countless lives across the villages, didn't come from ambition or strategy. It came from a brother who bled out somewhere she couldn't reach in time. That's the quiet influence Nawaki leaves behind. A child who never got a single real fight scene, who exists mostly in flashback, ends up rewriting how an entire world treats its wounded. His dream shaped Naruto's arc. His death shaped Tsunade's medicine. And the small crystal she gave him on his birthday becomes one of the most meaningful objects in the whole series, passed forward across a generation. So when you watch Tsunade hesitate over that necklace, or see her flinch at Naruto's ambition, remember it isn't superstition. It's grief, carefully coded into a single piece of jewelry, carried by a woman who learned the hardest way that the people you believe in most are the ones you're most afraid to lose. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Dan. Because to understand Tsunade, you almost have to understand the man who was supposed to be in the story a little differently than he ended up being. Dan Kato was Tsunade's lover, and his story completes the pattern that turned her into the person we meet in the series. On the surface, it looks like the show simply gave Tsunade a tragic romance to explain her sadness. But when you look closely, Dan wasn't just a love interest bolted onto her backstory. He was the missing piece that made everything before him rhyme. Her little brother Nawaki had a dream. Dan had the very same one, and that repetition is not an accident of writing. It's the whole point. Because Dan shared Nawaki's exact dream of becoming Hokage to protect the people he loved. Think about what that means for Tsunade. She had already buried a younger brother who believed that if he could just become strong enough, just reach the top, he could shield everyone precious to him. That belief got Nawaki killed. So when Tsunade meets a grown man carrying the identical conviction, she doesn't run from it. She falls for him deeply, precisely because he reminds her of the hope she lost. It's almost unbearable when you sit with it. She loved Dan partly because he was, in spirit, a continuation of the brother she couldn't save. And that sets up the cruelest echo of all. When Dan was fatally wounded in battle, Tsunade tried desperately to save him. She was already a gifted healer at this point, one of the most talented medical minds her village had ever produced. But she couldn't stop the bleeding. Everything she knew, every technique, every ounce of skill, none of it was enough. The man who carried her brother's dream died in her hands, the same way her brother had, and there was nothing her genius could do about it. Here's where the alternative version angle gets interesting, because there was a real design idea that never fully surfaced in the way you might expect. Dan's death wasn't written to make Tsunade sad in the ordinary sense. It was written to break something specific inside her. That single loss is the true root of her blood phobia, her hemophobia. And this is the contradiction that makes her one of the most unusual characters in the entire series. Here is a master medic, arguably the finest healer alive, who becomes physically paralyzed at the sight of blood. Think about how strange that is. It's like a surgeon who faints in the operating room. That paralysis traces back entirely to Dan. The blood on her hands as he died became a wound that never closed. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because you might assume Dan was purely a warrior, a would-be Hokage swinging around powerful jutsu. And in a sense, that's true. His own signature power was the spirit transformation technique, a will to protect made real. But here's the surprising callback that reverses the whole picture. He and Tsunade weren't truly opposites. They were mirrors of the same devotion, both understanding the fragile line between saving a life and losing one. So, when Tsunade failed to save him, she wasn't just failing to save a soldier. She was failing to save someone who carried her exact hope, who understood exactly how close she came and exactly why it wasn't enough. That's why it wrecked her so completely. A stranger dying is grief. The man who shared your dream dying in your arms is a personal collapse at the same time. But the legacy didn't end there, and this is the quiet detail that ties it all together. Dan had a niece. Her name was Shizune, and after Dan's death, Shizune became Tsunade's apprentice, following her, studying under her, standing at her side through decades of wandering. So the person constantly beside Tsunade throughout the series isn't a random assistant. She is a living thread back to Dan. Every time you see Shizune, you're looking at the last remaining branch of the man Tsunade loved and lost. Tsunade essentially kept his family close, carried his legacy forward, and trained the next generation of medical talent in his memory. Shizune learned her gift for medical ninjutsu from Tsunade herself, which means the healing lineage didn't die on that battlefield. It survived, passed from Tsunade to Shizune, quietly persisting even as Tsunade herself struggled to look at blood. So follow the chain one more time, because it's remarkably clean. Nawaki dreams of protecting people and dies. Dan carries the same dream and dies too. Both deaths involve blood Tsunade cannot stop. Therefore, the blood phobia. Therefore, the wandering. Therefore, the drinking and the gambling and the running from her own name. But therefore also, Shizune, the one piece of Dan that Tsunade could keep and protect and never lose. It's grief and continuation in the same person, and that's what makes Dan such a fascinating figure to study. He appears in flashbacks, briefly, almost gently, yet nearly everything defining about Tsunade points back to him. The fear, the withdrawal, the loyalty to Shizune, even the reason she believes in dreamers despite watching them die. Dan is the hidden hinge the whole character swings on. Not the loudest part of her story, but the quiet one underneath it. The man who shared a dream, left behind a family, and a legacy she has been protecting ever since. There's something most people don't know about Shizune. She's usually filed away in memory as the woman standing just behind Tsunade, the assistant, the aide, the one holding the paperwork and the pig. But if you trace her back to where Kishimoto first placed her in the story, you find something quieter and stranger. Shizune isn't a hired hand at all. She's family. She's the niece of Dan, the man whose death broke Tsunade in the first place. Think about what that means for a moment. The legacy Tsunade has been carrying all these years, the dream Dan left behind, didn't just pass to Tsunade. It passed to a whole bloodline, and Shizune is what remained of it. So when the story needed someone to stay at Tsunade's side through the worst of her grief, Kishimoto didn't reach for a stranger. He reached for the one person who shared the loss. Shizune wasn't following a mentor. She was following the last living thread of her own family. And that changes the shape of their wandering. Because Tsunade didn't leave the village on a mission. She fled. She fled from the memory of the people she'd lost, from a bloodline aversion that made her freeze at the sight of blood, from a name that carried too much weight. For years she drifted through gambling halls and settlements, running up debts she couldn't pay, chasing a luck that never came. That's not the journey of a hero. It's the journey of someone trying to disappear. And through all of it, Shizune stayed. That's the quiet detail worth sitting with. A younger woman, still grieving her own uncle, chose to anchor herself to a person who was slowly falling apart. She followed Tsunade from town to town, settled the debts when the numbers came due, and kept the two of them moving before the losses caught up. Kishimoto built Shizune as the counterweight, the steady one who held the pair together while Tsunade came undone. Without her, Tsunade's exile isn't a wandering legend. It's just a woman lost. But here's where the design gets interesting, because Kishimoto knew a story about two grieving women drifting through casinos could turn unbearably heavy. So he gave them a pig. Tauntaun, the little companion who trots along beside them, exists partly to soften the tone. A somber, wandering duo weighed down by debt and loss is a bleak picture. Add a small pig in a pearl necklace, and suddenly the scene can breathe. It's a deliberate bit of craft. The pig isn't comic relief thrown in at random. It's the thing that keeps the sadness from swallowing the whole picture. A warm spot in an otherwise cold stretch of the story. But what's really surprising comes next, because most people assume Shizune is simply riding along in Tsunade's shadow, a lesser version of the same medical skill. And that assumption gets it backwards. Shizune is a trained medical ninja in her own right, but she's also a poison specialist, someone who studied the darker edge of the medical arts. Her fighting style leans on techniques built from the very discipline Tsunade turned away from. She can extract poisons, and she can deliver them, using a hidden senbon mechanism to strike at close range. This is someone who took the healing craft and sharpened it into something she could actually fight with. And that leads to the real irony sitting at the center of these two women. Tsunade is remembered as the greatest medical ninja of her generation, the one who revolutionized the field, the one whose knowledge saved countless lives. But during those years of exile, Tsunade wasn't practicing medicine. Her fear of blood had made the work she was best at nearly impossible for her. She avoided the very thing that made her legendary. So the healing tradition, the day-to-day work of tending wounds, mixing remedies, keeping people alive, didn't fall to Tsunade at all. It fell to Shizune. Sit with that reversal. For years, the person actually carrying the medical legacy of the Senju, the person keeping those skills alive in practice, not just in reputation, was the quieter of the two. Tsunade held the fame. Shizune held the craft. And in a story so much about legacy, about what one generation leaves for the next, that's a detail Kishimoto placed with real care. The tradition didn't survive because of the famous one. It survived because of the one standing behind her. Which brings the whole picture full circle. Dan dreamed of becoming Hokage and left that dream unfinished. Tsunade inherited it and then ran from it. But the practical work, the healing, the discipline, the steady hands, that survived through Shizune, the niece who carried her uncle's bloodline forward without ever asking for credit. She's the bridge between the man who dreamed and the woman who eventually returned to finish what he started. So the next time Shizune appears in the story, quietly at Tsunade's shoulder with Tauntaun at her feet, it's worth remembering what she really is. Not an assistant, not a shadow. She's the last thread of a lost family, the anchor that held a grieving legend together, and the one who kept a healing tradition breathing through the years its greatest master couldn't bear to touch. What very few people realize is that Orochimaru was never meant to be a simple villain lurking in the shadows of this arc. When the writers brought him back into Tsunade's story, they made a deliberate choice to reintroduce him not as a monster, but as a familiar face, the old teammate who reappears at her lowest possible point and very nearly turns her to his side. That detail matters because it changes the entire texture of the encounter. This isn't a stranger threatening her. This is someone who knows her. And knowing her is exactly what makes him dangerous. The three of them, Tsunade, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru, trained together as children under Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage. They were the original legendary Sannin, a title earned during the Second Great Ninja War when they survived a confrontation with Hanzo of the Salamander. So when Orochimaru sits across from her and speaks, he isn't guessing at her weaknesses. He watched her lose her little brother Nawaki. He watched her lose Dan, the man she loved. He knows precisely which wounds to press, because he was standing nearby while those wounds were first made. But here is where the writing becomes far more clever than it first appears. Orochimaru couldn't simply overpower her. His arms had been ruined, destroyed during his battle with Hiruzen, sealed by the Third Hokage's dying technique, so that he could no longer form the hand signs that made him one of the most feared shinobi alive. So the man who wanted to manipulate Tsunade was, in a very real sense, helpless. He needed her. And that reversal is the engine that drives the entire confrontation. Because he needed healing, he had to offer something in return. And he offered the one thing she could never stop wanting. He promised to use his forbidden reincarnation technique to bring back Nawaki and Dan, to return the dead brother and the lost lover, in exchange for restoring the use of his arms. It's a chillingly precise piece of temptation. He doesn't offer her power. He doesn't offer her money, though she gambles compulsively and carries enormous debt. He offers her the two people whose deaths hollowed her out and drove her away from the village decades earlier. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that temptation is the actual test at the heart of this entire arc. On the surface, the story is about whether Tsunade will agree to become the Fifth Hokage. Underneath, it's about something much older and much heavier. For a long stretch of these episodes, Tsunade genuinely considers his offer. She schedules a meeting. She weighs it. The woman who abandoned Konoha, who lost her faith in the dream of becoming Hokage because everyone who ever held that dream in front of her died young. She comes remarkably close to betraying her own village for the chance to see her loved ones breathe again. The writers let that hesitation sit, and they let it feel real, because a refusal only means something if the temptation was truly heavy. If she'd said no instantly, there would be no arc. So they built the whole sequence around the possibility that she might say yes. That's the quiet brilliance of the structure. Her lowest point isn't a battle she's losing. It's a choice she's afraid she'll make. But the choice tips the other way, and it tips because of Naruto. Throughout their time together, Naruto reminds her of the two men she lost. Both Nawaki and Dan had spoken the same words about becoming Hokage, about protecting the people they loved, and both had died chasing that dream. When Naruto declares the very same ambition with the very same stubbornness, it reopens the grief. But it also does something else. It shows her that the dream itself didn't die with them. It's still alive, standing right in front of her, wearing an orange jumpsuit and refusing to give up. So when the moment of truth arrives, and Orochimaru's true intentions surface, Tsunade turns on him. She chooses to protect Naruto instead of accepting the resurrection of the dead. And that decision is the exact instant she reclaims what the story calls the will of the Senju, the inherited resolve of her grandfather Hashirama, the first Hokage, the man who founded the village and dreamed of a place where children wouldn't have to die in war. She stops running from that legacy. She agrees to become Hokage. What makes this such a satisfying piece of construction is that every element pays off something planted earlier. Her medical genius, developed after Dan bled out in her arms and left her with a paralyzing fear of blood, becomes the very thing Orochimaru needs. Her grief becomes the lever he tries to pull. And her grandfather's philosophy, which she'd spent years resenting because it seemed to demand endless sacrifice, becomes the reason she finally stands and fights. Orochimaru walks away from that confrontation without his healing, his manipulation undone by the one variable he couldn't account for, a loud, hopeful boy who reminded a broken woman why the dream was worth carrying. And Tsunade walks toward Konoha carrying that dream herself, no longer as an assistant, no longer as a shadow, but as the Fifth Hokage. The teammate who came to break her instead became the final push that made her whole. The story of Jiraiya begins where Tsunade's own story turns. because the man who found her at the lowest point of her life was not a messenger or a stranger, but the third of the three Sannin, her old teammate from the days of Hiruzen Sarutobi. Jiraiya was the one who tracked her down across the gambling towns and quiet roadside taverns where she had spent years drifting. And he did it for a single reason. Konoha needed a new Hokage. The third had died, and Jiraiya himself had already turned the position down. He believed Tsunade was the right choice, so he set out to bring her home, even knowing she would resist him every step of the way. Their bond, though, ran far deeper than a single mission. These two had trained together under the same master, survived the same wars, and buried the same friends. Decades of shared history sat between them, which is why Jiraiya knew exactly which argument would reach her when nothing else could. He didn't try to appeal to her sense of duty, because he understood she had abandoned that long ago. Instead, he introduced her to a loud, stubborn 12-year-old boy named Naruto Uzumaki, and he placed his faith openly in that child's future. That faith would become the lever that moved her. Here is where the story produces one of its most unusual records, and it comes in the form of a wager. Tsunade was a lifelong gambler, but she carried a reputation that most gamblers would rather hide. She lost so consistently, so predictably, that people gave her a nickname for it. They called her the legendary sucker, because in the world of Naruto, her losing streak was treated almost as a running certainty, an ongoing statistic of failure so reliable that a win from her was considered a bad omen. And it was this famously unlucky woman who agreed to stake something priceless. She bet her grandfather's necklace, the crystal that had belonged to the First Hokage, on whether Naruto could learn the Rasengan. The tension in that bet is what makes it matter. The necklace was not an ordinary piece of jewelry. It had been passed down from Hashirama Senju, and Tsunade had already given it away twice before, once to her younger brother Nawaki, and once to the man she loved, Dan. Both of them died shortly after receiving it. So in her mind, the necklace had become a curse, an object that seemed to kill everyone she handed it to. Offering it to Naruto in a wager was not generosity. It was almost a challenge to fate itself, a test to see whether this boy would share the same ending as everyone else who dared to dream too loudly in front of her. Naruto, of course, learned the technique. He mastered the Rasengan through sheer refusal to quit, and in doing so, he lost Tsunade the bet in the most literal sense. Yet in spirit, she lost it gladly, because watching him complete that jutsu did something her cold reasoning could not. It reminded her of Nawaki and of Dan, two people who had spoken the exact same impossible words Naruto now spoke. The dream of becoming Hokage and protecting the village. For the first time in years, that dream did not feel like a death sentence to her. It felt alive again, standing right in front of her in the shape of a grinning child. And so, she surrendered the necklace, not as a curse handed off, but as a blessing, finally given to someone she believed could survive it. And yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because this partnership between the two of them did not simply fade into a peaceful retirement. Jiraiya remained one of the few people whose judgment Tsunade trusted without question, which is exactly why his fate struck her as hard as it did. Years later, Jiraiya left the village on his own to investigate the leader of the Akatsuki, a figure known as Pain in the Hidden Rain. He went alone, gathering intelligence on an enemy nobody fully understood, and he did not come back. He was killed in that battle, and the news of his death reached Tsunade as Hokage. The loss did more than wound her personally. It marked a turning point in her strength as a leader, because the burden of holding the village together, combined with the grief of losing the last of her old teammates, wore her down in ways that were both emotional and physical. When pain later assaulted Konoha directly, Tsunade poured nearly everything she had into protecting the villagers, shielding them with her healing and her power, until her body simply gave out. She fell into a coma, and that coma is what ended her time as the Fifth Hokage. In a quiet, almost invisible way, the death of the man who once recruited her became one of the threads that unraveled her tenure. So the arc closes with a kind of symmetry. Jiraiya found Tsunade when she had given up, convinced her to gamble on a boy's future, and handed her a reason to walk back into leadership. His faith started her final chapter, and his loss helped bring it to a close. The teammate who came to break her had first made her whole, and in the end, his absence proved just how much of her strength had quietly rested on him all along. Behind the familiar appearance of Hashirama Senju, there is a story that quietly reshapes everything people assume about his granddaughter. Because Tsunade is not simply a legendary medic who happened to be born into a famous clan. She is the last surviving member of Hashirama's direct bloodline, the final thread of the Senju line that founded the entire village she would one day lead. And when you understand that, her strength stops looking like raw talent and starts looking like inheritance, something passed down, carried, and eventually surpassed. Hashirama was the first Hokage, the man remembered for his impossible vitality, his wood release, and a life force so overwhelming that his cells alone became the stuff of forbidden experiments for generations afterward. That vitality did not vanish when he died. It settled quietly into his descendants, and in Tsunade, it resurfaced as monstrous chakra reserves and control so precise that she could concentrate it into a single point on her forehead. That mark, the yin seal that spreads across her face in battle, is not decoration. It is the visible sign of Hashirama's endurance living on in her body, refined into something new. But here is where the expected story begins to bend. You would assume that a granddaughter's power would be a smaller echo of the grandfather's, an inheritance diminished by time. With Tsunade, the opposite is true. She took the Senju vitality and did something Hashirama himself never openly demonstrated. She turned patience into a weapon. Her most iconic technique is the strength of 100 seal, and the way it works runs against everything you would expect from a healer. Most medical ninjutsu spends chakra in the moment. You draw on your reserves and mend a wound as it happens. Tsunade does the reverse. For years, sometimes literally years at a time, she stores chakra inside that forehead seal, feeding it slowly, hoarding it while it does nothing at all. To an outside observer, it looks like wasted potential sitting idle. But that stored reserve is the entire point. When she finally releases it, the seal unfolds across her body and grants regeneration on a scale that dwarfs ordinary healing. She does not stitch wounds closed one at a time. She rebuilds herself continuously, faster than damage can accumulate. So the counterintuitive truth is this. The medic famous for healing others spent much of her life secretly not spending her power, and that restraint made her nearly impossible to kill. But here's what almost nobody knows about just how far that endurance stretches. During the Fourth Great Ninja War, Tsunade fought alongside the other Kage against Madara Uchiha, and in that battle she was cut clean in half. For almost any shinobi, in almost any story, that is the end. There is no recovering from being severed at the waist. Yet because she had spent years quietly filling the strength of 100 seal, she had a reserve deep enough to survive it. The regeneration held her together long enough for her to be saved, and she kept fighting.
That single moment is the clearest proof of the whole idea. Her survival was not luck. It was the Senju life force, the same vitality that made Hashirama a legend, stored and disciplined until the exact instant it was needed most. And that connection runs deeper than biology. Hashirama did not become famous only for his strength. He became famous for a dream. He believed that shinobi did not have to live as scattered mercenaries, locked in endless cycles of revenge and loss. He imagined a place where children would not have to die in wars fought over old grudges, a village where former enemies could raise the next generation in peace. Konoha was that dream made real, built by his hands and held together by his conviction that the future mattered more than the pain of the past. Tsunade's life for a long time ran directly against that ideal. She lost her younger brother. She lost the man she loved. Grief drove her away from the village and away from the very principles her grandfather had died defending. She wandered, she gambled, she tried to outrun everything the Senju name stood for. So when she is finally asked to return and become the Fifth Hokage, the decision is not really about power at all. It is about which will she chooses to carry. And this is the quiet resolution that ties the whole thing together. Tsunade chooses to defend the living rather than chase the dead. She stops running from loss and turns to face the future, accepting the same burden Hashirama once carried. In doing so, she does something no medical technique ever could. She completes his founding dream, not by fighting his old battles, but by protecting the village he built so the next generation could inherit it whole. So the last of Hashirama's direct line ends up being far more than a granddaughter with an inherited seal. She is the one who took his vitality and taught it patience, who took his dream and lived long enough to guard it, who survived being torn apart because a boy long dead had believed peace was worth building. The strength people admire in Tsunade looks like brute force, but underneath it is something gentler and far more stubborn, the refusal to let a founder's hope die with him. And that, more than the chakra or the seal or the healing, is what truly makes her the keeper of the Senju will. If you look closely at Katsuyu, you'll notice something that almost feels like an accident of design, a lucky twist that ended up defining everything about who Tsunade is. Because here is the first surprise. Every one of the legendary Sannin was paired with a creature, and two of those pairings scream danger. Jiraiya rode toads into battle, massive and brawling. Orochimaru commanded snakes, coiled and venomous and eager to strike. So you would expect Tsunade, the physically strongest of the three, the one who can shatter the ground with a single finger, to summon the most terrifying beast of all. But she doesn't. She summons a slug. A giant, soft, unhurried slug that would rather protect than attack. And that quiet mismatch turns out to be the whole point. Because Katsuyu is almost entirely defensive. She doesn't lunge or bite or crush. Her strength is in shielding, in absorbing, in enduring. And that gentleness mirrors something true about Tsunade that the story keeps trying to remind us of. For all her monstrous strength, Tsunade's real calling was never war. It was healing. She is a medic first and a fighter second, and her summon reflects that inner truth far better than a toad or a snake ever could. So what looks at first like a strange, almost anticlimactic choice is actually the most honest one. Her partner in battle is a healer's companion. But that gentleness isn't just flavor, and this is where the accident becomes something powerful. Katsuyu can split her body apart, not into 2, not into 10, but into hundreds of smaller slugs, each one a living piece of the whole. And because Tsunade channels her medical chakra through Katsuyu,
those hundreds of fragments can carry her healing to hundreds of people at the same moment. So instead of mending one wounded person at a time, Tsunade can, in effect, treat an entire village at once. And that is not a hypothetical. During Pain's assault on Konoha, when the village was being torn apart and bodies were falling faster than any single medic could reach them, Katsuyu divided herself across the whole ruined city. Each little slug settled onto the wounded and poured Tsunade's chakra into them, keeping people alive who otherwise would have died in the rubble. A single summon became a network of care stretched over an entire population. What began as a gentle defensive creature became one of the most quietly heroic forces in the entire war. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because the choice of a slug wasn't random at all. It comes from old Japanese folklore, from a tale called the three-way deadlock. In that story, 3 creatures are locked in an endless standoff. The snake devours the frog swallows the slug, and the slug, strangely enough, dissolves the snake. Each one beats another, and each one is beaten in turn. A perfect loop with no true winner. The ancient version of rock, paper, scissors. So when Kishimoto built the 3 Sannin, he reached straight into that legend. Orochimaru became the snake. Jiraiya became the frog, the toad, and Tsunade became the slug. 3 rivals, 3 creatures, locked forever in that same folkloric triangle. What feels like a lucky bit of symbolism is actually a centuries-old story quietly threaded through their entire rivalry. And once you see that, the slug makes even more sense for her, not less. Because a slug, in the real world, isn't a fighter. It secretes a protective slime. It moves slowly. It survives by patience and persistence rather than aggression. It thrives quietly, out of sight, asking for nothing. So, instead of an intimidating monster that matches Tsunade's raw power, her partner reflects the opposite qualities: patience, endurance, support. It is a deeply counterintuitive symbol for the strongest of the 3 Sannin, and that contradiction is exactly why it works. Her power was never the point. Her willingness to protect and to heal was. And there is one last detail, a small one, that turns this from clever design into something that genuinely matters. Katsuyu doesn't behave like a beast at all. She speaks calmly, with a soft, motherly formality, patient and reassuring even in the middle of catastrophe. And her loyalty doesn't end with Tsunade. It carries forward across generations. When Sakura becomes Tsunade's medical student, learning the same healing arts, inheriting the same impossible strength, Katsuyu bonds with her too. So the slug becomes a living thread, passed quietly from teacher to apprentice. The same creature that shielded a village under Tsunade goes on to stand beside Sakura, carrying the same gift into a new pair of hands. And that is the accident that stopped being an accident. A soft, defensive slug, chosen because of an old folk tale about a 3-way deadlock, ends up being the perfect vessel for everything the Senju line was really about. Not domination, not fear, but healing, protection, and the quiet insistence on keeping people alive. Through Katsuyu, that will doesn't stay locked inside one person. It splits, like the slug herself, into many smaller pieces and spreads outward, from Hashirama's dream to Tsunade's hands, and from Tsunade's hands to Sakura's. A lucky twist of design became the very thing that let a founder's hope survive, generation after generation, carried gently on the back of the least frightening creature in the entire story. Tonight, we drifted through the world of Naruto, following Tsunade's story all the way to Katsuyu's gentle whisper. Thank you for wandering these quiet paths with me, and feel how softly sleep is settling in now.
And now, let these stories carry you gently into sleep. Sweet dreams.